you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for Elisabeth for the introduction to what we're here to talk about, and thank you to our guests here on the panel. I'll briefly, many of them, again, I think you know well, but to my right is Bliss, president of the Coalition of Service Industries, and previously assistant USTR for Services and Investment. Josh Kallmer with the Information Technology Industry Council, Executive Vice President for Policy, previously with Crowell and Mooring, and probably a highlight of his career was sharing office with me 10 years ago when we both at USTR. And then on the end is Professor Anupam Chander, who joins us from Georgetown Law, although if you read his bio, and all the bios are in the brochure here, he has, seems like he's visited just about every high-class academic institution in the United States, including studying at Harvard and Yale. So, welcome. So our mission today is to look at why this initiative is happening, and what is it that is creating the need for new rules, and why one would look to the World Trade Organization as a place to take that up. So to start things off, I thought we'd say, and given that the subject of the new rules is digital trade, that implies to me that there's something in the digital space that has created this need. So what is it about digital technology that has changed and affected the economy and government policies in a way that is prompting governments, a push for governments to work together toward an international agreement? To start things off, I thought I'd go with a guy whose organization has technology in its name. So Josh, why don't you take us down?
Thanks, Chris, and everybody. It's great to be here. Let me first thank Ken and Diego and all of your colleagues at WTO. You just continue to punch above your weight. Fantastic organization. And also Elisabeth and your colleagues. We've interacted both with your colleagues in government and with others out there, and there's just uniform praise for the leadership that Australia has shown in this process in running an inclusive and high standard process. So thank you for that. This is actually a really important way, I think, to start the conversation. What we've observed is that the notion of digital trade has really evolved. In fact, the term e-commerce continues to be used in this context, I think because it has a history in the WTO and a certain set of meanings, but really digital trade seems to us to be a better way to think about the endeavor. Historically, as we've viewed it, digital trade has seemed to be something that occurs at the intersection of digital technologies and some sort of business transaction. So whether or not you're using the internet to buy or sell a good or buy or sell a service, traditionally digital trade has focused on that act, and in the context of policy, government rules and practices relating to those kinds of transactions. As we've, I think, better understood how digital technologies work, and as those technologies have evolved, we've come to appreciate that really digital trade relates to a lot more than just that transaction and those transactions. It relates to all of the ways in which digital technologies support businesses, whether or not an actual transaction is taking place. So Christine is going to talk a little bit more about the effects outside of the technology space in particular, but I'll just say it's companies internally, manufacturers sending data to organize production. It's people interacting with their service partners that they've already contracted with to get things done. All of the ways data moves to facilitate business. It's happening constantly. It's happening around the world. And what we've come to appreciate is that those transfers and those uses of technologies interact with government policy in multiples of ways beyond just what happens when a transaction takes place. As I think Ken said, there really is no, I put it, I think, a similar way, there really is no digital economy. There's just an economy and it's digital now. And that's why we need to do something like this WTO initiative.
Thank you, Josh. Let's see, Christy, he invited you to speak to some non-tech applications.
Well, I actually think it's a mixture. So, from the services perspective, and my organization and members agree with Josh that I think digital is a far better term than e-commerce, and it covers more, and I think it's just more of a useful term. But from a services perspective, you start with the fact that services accounts for about 50% of global trade flows. And those global trade flows are now very intermixed with the flow of data. And I will just say, because I see the international trade person sitting in the audience, that one of the challenges going forward is not only are we still not where we should be in measuring the flow of services trade and investment, but we're also even farther behind with respect to measurement of data flows. But be that as it may, with the explosion of data flows and the increase in cross-border services trade, that's really in many ways underlying the rapid increase in digital trade. And another dimension to this is services are not only being digitally enabled themselves, traditional services from insurance to shopping to other things, to legal services, but they are also intimately involved in the provision of those digital services. So Josh mentioned technology, and software, and it's also services, and it's really those things, it's really those things mixed together. Sorry. So I was just saying that services is very much a piece of what we're referring to as digital trade, because it's often the technology involved, whether it's software, implementation of sensors and equipment, and the service that together are providing and enabling that digital trade flow. So services is very much a part of the mix and why it's so important to services sectors. But then secondly, as Josh also alluded to, there's also the digitization of services themselves, which is critically important. And again, that's cutting across the spectrum of services, from ICT services themselves to financial services to media entertainment, professional services, logistics, you name it. And digitization is occurring. And the third point I would make, and again, Josh alluded to it, is that services historically have supported traditional areas like manufacturing and agriculture, but digitization is compounding that effect. So concern about digitization and digital trade and phenomena should not be and is not confined to not only the tech sector or services, but much more broadly in the economy in terms of manufacturing. Smart technology is probably the most familiar example. In agriculture, you've got smart tractors that let farmers test their soil quality. One of my favorite examples are the connected cows that have chips in their hooves, and so you can measure milk production, fertility, or even pigs, where they're now using facial recognition to recognize swine flu. So the reason I bring these examples up is I think we need to, Elisabeth's point, I think we need to do a better job of educating so that we really reach not only to large enterprises directly engaged in ICT trade, but also the many small enterprises that benefit it through ICT platforms, but also getting down into the industries themselves, from manufacturing to agriculture, because they're obviously very dependent on data flows as well. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Professor, anything you want to add?
No, I'll just confirm everything that's been said before. Just with one line, which is, to have a customer is to have data. To have an international customer is to have international flows of data.
Okay, thank you. Well, so all of this sounds great, all these new capabilities, smart cows. So what's the problem?
So, and again, let me just say that I hope the smart cow, the smart pig driving in a self-driving car will be an image that sticks in your brain, so that we begin to think about digital trade as being much bigger, again, than just tech and the tech industry. So what are the problems? So understandably, when governments were met with this explosion of data flows and rapid increase in cross-border services trade, and as Josh was saying, digital aspects being involved in virtually more and more, if not all, commercial transactions, governments had concerns about what are the security implications, what are the implications for privacy, what are the implications for consumer privacy, and I know we'll be talking a bit more about that later in the program. But largely in light of that, and also some degree of just blatant protectionism and wanting to protect countries' own industries, you've got a raft of barriers. And I would put them into two buckets. The first bucket I would call digital trade barriers, and there they come in the form of either blocks, partial blocks, or conditioning the cross-border delivery of data on some kind of local content or making it highly restricted. The second aspect of that are data localization measures, which typically involve the requirement that you maintain in-country a server to store and process data within the country. There can also be other permutations, like requiring the transfer of technology may be involved, and again, specific requirements with regard to local content. So I would say, in a very broad brush way, those are the kinds of strictly digital barriers. But then there's a second bucket that I think is important, and that is the underlying service that's being supplied. You may find that there is a prohibition on the cross-border delivery of the service, or that you have to establish a local presence in order to supply the service. There may also be, and if you are willing and want to establish in a particular country, which many service suppliers do, because they're heavily regulated or want to be near their customers, you may have limitations on the amount of foreign direct investment. You may have to get a JV partner. You may have to share your technology with a JV partner. You may have to get a license to engage in that activity. So there are a whole raft of services barriers in addition to the digital trade barriers. And my last point would really be that you really have to be able to tackle both kinds of barriers to truly get in, operate your business, and enjoy commercial success. And the last thing I will say is, I think it's important for governments to realize that there are real costs to these barriers. Whether it's data localization, whether it's the idea of slapping a tariff on e-commerce, where there's been a long-standing moratorium in the WTO and imposition of customs duties. Studies have shown, and more recent ones in particular, that whatever revenue gains the governments think they may achieve are far outweighed by the welfare costs and the overall loss in taxes and other revenue. So again, I think there's a cautionary tale to be found. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Josh, I think
Yeah, I was just going to agree with everything that Christine said. One way to ask the question is the way you asked it, Chris, what's the problem? But another way to look at it is, and it's fair to make that judgment, but it's also fair, I think, not to make a judgment in the question. In other words, to recognize that governments around the world and people around the world are still grappling with what this means, what it means to have digital technologies so embedded into everything that happens in business primarily. So whereas with trade in goods, where it makes sense or you can understand why individual economies have their own trade policies, and you know when a good crosses a border and you know where it is physically, and even with a service where you can set up rules relating to trade and service, and you know whether that act has happened, and you can either impose barriers or liberalize barriers and fight over that. In those contexts, doing things at the national level or at the economy level, say in the EU, makes sense conceptually, even if we disagree about how to do it. I at least personally have found that data and digital technologies have a somewhat different character, and that qualitatively the analysis ought to be somewhat different. In other words, the way that data in particular affects our lives and affects the global economy is much less segmentable and segregable on the basis of national lines. And therefore, along the lines of what Christine said, the risks of solely national-based approaches to data and digital technologies are much higher, and the need for cooperation and for cross-border rules is much greater. There's a different conceptual exercise going on here, I truly believe, and that's why this exercise in the WTO and doing it at as multilateral a level as possible is so systemically important to a rational, to what is ultimately a collectively rational rather than sort of a collectively perverse outcome if you've got individual economies all taking different approaches to this thing that isn't really a thing, that really can't be thought about along national lines.
Great. So let me just pick up a little bit on both my colleagues' statements. I think Christine and Josh are exactly right. And the traditional understanding of trade law is that it's designed to forestall protectionism, because every country is always trying to engineer ways to protect its favorite industries. And that's what trade law has typically been about. But I think that is a critical intervention needed here. But as Josh says, there's also an affirmative case to be made for why we want to improve the world, not just to kind of avoid protectionism that's going to pop up, but also to make people confident that as they engage in this kind of international digital trade, because your phone is a digital trading device, so we're constantly embedded in a huge global exchange, especially more so for people outside the United States, which are constantly interfacing with American companies on a kind of minute-by-minute basis, right? So it's really important to see that. So the question then is, how do we make sure that people feel protected and secure? So we need consumer protection rules that operate at a global scale. We need privacy protections that operate at a global scale. So if we can create a new paradigm of international trade law that not only ensures that things can travel across borders, but that things are safe when they travel across borders, that your personal protections aren't eviscerated as you now interface with companies across the world. I think that's critical in all this. And so any framework can't just be written to protect the industrial powers that want to sell goods across borders or sell services across borders. It must be written with consumers first and foremost in mind.
Thank you. And Professor, so you mentioned a couple of policy spheres that are underlying the grappling that Josh described of governments with this new environment. I think consumer protection and privacy. Are there others that what's the universe of government objectives, and to what extent is that are they doing the right thing?
So if you look at the proposals that have been mooted at WTO by the EU and the United States, they're really focused largely on their domestic enterprises. They are designed to open up the rest of the world for their enterprises and still protect their own domestic policy space in ways that they find preferable. And I think it's important to think about how do we bring in the rest of the world to this kind of large apparatus. So there hasn't been any effort. So you'll see emerging across the world in some trade agreements, some bilateral trade agreements, a developing country chapter, a chapter that commits the wealthy partner to making substantial investments that promote development in places. So I think any agreement, I know the Doha Development Round is dead, but there should never be an international trade agreement that doesn't put development at one of the very top goals. And not just development because, by letting in capitalism, development flourishes. I think that's an inadequate approach to development as a commitment. It's rather development as we will make sure that we're thinking about this from the ground up and ensuring that there are protections that are available that help countries across the world develop.
Thank you, and it's good to hear. I mean, the sense that development can have multiple meanings, and to think about exactly how it's being used. Those of us who have been in the WTO context have this sort of chills up your spine when you hear development objective, because it can mean developing countries do absolutely nothing and maybe get some money. I think we need to evolve beyond that to have the sense that you showed of how we build up. You also mentioned, would either of you like to jump in?
Very quickly, and I don't know if Josh had something he wanted to add as well, but not disagreeing at all, but just to note that I think the Australian chair, Ambassador Listen, has been very clear in particular that development is being looked at every stage and on every issue. So really, to Australia and Japan and Singapore's credit, I think from the beginning of the discussions, they really recognized that that was going to be a very important part of the negotiation and finding creative solutions. And secondly, I would just say that I think there are elements that not just the US and the EU, but others have talked about that can go toward that end. And that is the requirement to establish a privacy framework, to encourage cybersecurity cooperation. And yes, there needs to be more. And I know certainly US industry supports the idea of trade facilitation being included, which again is something developing countries have looked at. So just, again, not disagreeing, but just, I think there are elements there that can be worked with in negotiation.
Thank you, Christy. The professor mentioned the objectives that have been put forward in different proposals, and indicated that they are somewhat selfishly oriented, and that understandably they reflect the positions of an individual member, and those positions are drafted based on the input they receive from constituents and stakeholders in their markets. So they are by definition parochial or local. But I think the Elisabeth referred to the process being, I think, bottom up, or where the idea is you stir all of these together and then see what everybody wants and come up with a stew that works. But maybe we could talk a little bit in more detail about the actual nature of the objectives that have been put forward on the table. Josh, would you like to jump in on that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. So a variety of economies, I think over 10 now, have put in papers. Some of those papers are freely available. Others are restricted. Basically, all of them are out there somewhere, and so we're getting a good sense of the kinds of things that different economies are identifying. And for the most part, it's not surprising, and the U.S. in general appears to have taken an approach that resembles what is negotiated in the USMCA. The European Union has taken an approach that is solid, but that also reflects very high priority on leaving significant government regulatory discretion, particularly in the area of data protection. We can talk about that a little bit. We gather that the Chinese approach involves a pretty clear red line about how data will be treated and the concept, as it's known, of internet sovereignty. And then we've also seen some approaches from developing country governments that I think Nigeria is a good example. Even though I'm not sure that they put in a paper, we've talked to a lot of these delegations though, that want to be engaged, want to be in a position developmentally to sign on to high standards, but that are frankly worried about impacts to domestic competitiveness and domestic growth. So very reasonable that we see a lot of different perspectives that reflect the way that countries have typically negotiated. I think a lot, that the success of this endeavor will turn on the extent to which there is political will in all of these markets to be creative and to not necessarily view the priorities of other parties as problems to be solved, but as other interests to be reconciled. In some cases, and we can talk about this more, we believe, and privacy is a good example of this, that it's eminently achievable. There are others where it will be much more difficult, but it's still very early, and there's a lot of time to go before governments are making critical decisions about what the nature of this thing will be.
Anyone?
I would just add to Josh's comments that I think that on the positive side, it was very encouraging that you did have a group of ministers coming out of Davos announcing their intention to commence negotiations. I think some would argue in Geneva that actually was a soft launch, and so that if there's a more formal launch down the road, that's a good thing, but things are up and running, and as Josh said, more than roughly 10 or so countries have submitted proposals, but it's just the beginning of the process. I think I would also highlight the fact that Brazil is in the mix, and previously Brazil had not been as positive on the issue, but with the change in government, they seem to have really changed to be much more positively engaged. I would also say that it's very significant that you have 3 LDCs that have joined that group of 77, including Benin, and that's a very positive development. And so I think an area of great importance in the work going forward will be to work with and encourage the greater participation of those LDCs, but also reach out to others. Josh mentioned Nigeria. I think Senegal has been another one that has spoken up in meetings. And so I think there's a very good dynamic, a sense of momentum, and I think the 3 meetings that will happen over the next several months hopefully will produce very positive results, and then where people go from there remains to be seen. But nonetheless, I think the coalescing of groups of issues that have been discussed for some time are very important. And then the last thing on China, as Josh said, I think China has drawn a pretty strong red line in not wanting to get into disciplines on data flows and feeling like it's too premature in the discussion, and they're very focused on the goods aspect of e-commerce and things related to that. So we'll see how that plays out. And then in the backdrop, an unfortunate source of tension, which I think also has to be managed, but in a reasonable way, and that is India in particular and South Africa. And